You don't insult a man holding a wrench when your $60 million jet refuses to start. Billionaire CEO Claire Montgomery learned that the hard way, staring at the grease-stained single father fueling her plane in a freezing storm. She threw a mocking challenge at him. "Fly this jet, then we'll talk." She thought it was a joke. 10 minutes later, she was strapped into her leather seat, white-knuckled, watching this anonymous, nobody execute a violent crosswind takeoff that defied the laws of physics. The tarmac at Teterboro Airport was a desolate expanse of cracked asphalt and freezing rain. It was November, the kind of wet, biting cold that bypassed a heavy coat and settled directly into the bones. Claire Montgomery did not feel the cold. She felt only the acidic, rising burn of a ticking clock, inside the cabin of her Gulfstream G65. Oh, the air was stagnant. The faint smell of aged leather and expensive citrus room spray usually calmed her. Today, it felt like the inside of a coffin. She paced the length of the aisle, her heels clicking a frantic, erratic rhythm against the hardwood accents. "What do you mean, we're stuck?" Claire's voice was deathly quiet. It was a tone that usually made her board of directors sweat through their bespoke suits. Standing in the cockpit doorway was Bradley. He was a contract pilot, 28 years old, with perfectly styled hair and a flight suit that looked like it had never seen a drop of sweat. Her regular pilot had been sidelined by a burst appendix 12 hours ago. Bradley was the expensive, highly rated replacement her fixer had found on short notice. Right now, Bradley was looking everywhere but at Claire. "Ms. Montgomery, the Auxiliary Power Unit, the APU, is throwing a fault code. We can't initiate engine start. And even if we could, ground control is talking about a ground stop. The crosswinds are gusting to 45 knots. I don't care if it's raining fire, Bradley," Claire said, stopping her pacing. She turned to face him, her jaw tight. "I have a merger meeting in London in exactly 9 hours. If I'm not sitting at that mahogany table by 8 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, a hostile takeover goes through. I lose my company. 3,000 people lose their jobs. Do you understand the math?" "I do, ma'am, but aviation regulations are written for people who aren't paying $20,000 an hour for a solution," she snapped. "Fix the plane." Bradley flushed, retreating into the cockpit. Claire rubbed her temples. She was 34, running a logistics empire her father had built, and subsequently driven to the edge of bankruptcy before handing it to her. She had spent 5 years pulling it out of the mud. This London deal was the final cornerstone. If she missed it, she lost everything. Outside, a fuel truck was parked near the right wing. Arthur Hayes stood beneath the massive fuselage, rain slicking his high-visibility vest to his broad shoulders. He was 39, but the deep lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived a few extra lifetimes. He held the heavy nozzle of the Jet A fuel hose, the smell of kerosene thick in the damp air. His knuckles were permanently stained with grease, the skin dry and cracked. Artie wasn't supposed to be working the ramp today. It was his day off. But Maya, his 7-year-old daughter, needed a new set of hearing aids, and insurance was playing its usual bureaucratic games. Overtime was the only language the billing department understood. So Artie was freezing on the tarmac while his elderly neighbor watched Maya. He finished the fueling, disconnected the hose, and secured the cap. As he walked past the nose gear, he heard the whining, sputtering sound of the Gulfstream's APU trying to turn over. It spooled up, hit a high pitch, and then choked out with a hollow clunk. Artie paused. He wiped the rain from his eyes, staring at the small exhaust port near the tail. He knew that sound. He dragged his fueling ladder toward the cabin door, intending to drop off the fuel slip. As he climbed the air stairs, the heated air of the cabin hit him, along with the sharp, tense voices from inside. "I've reset the breaker 3 times, Bradley was saying, sounding panicky. "It's a hard fault, Ms. Montgomery. We need a mechanic. We're grounded." "Get one out here, then." "It's 11 p.m. on a Sunday in a sleet storm. Nobody's coming." Artie stepped into the entryway. He didn't want to get involved. He just wanted a signature so he could go thaw his hands under the break room hand dryer. But he also knew what desperation looked like. He saw it in the mirror every time the medical bills arrived. He saw it now in the rigid posture of the woman standing in the cabin. "Excuse me," Artie said. His voice was gravelly, low, completely devoid of the deferential customer service pitch the pilots used. Claire whipped around. She took in the sight of him, a towering wet man in a cheap, oil-stained jumpsuit holding a clipboard. "What?" she barked, her patience entirely evaporated. "Your APU isn't broken," Artie said calmly. He didn't cross the threshold into her pristine cabin. He knew his boots would ruin the carpet. "It's a known glitch on the G650s in high humidity and freezing temps. The intake sensor frosts over. If you reset the breaker while holding the manual override switch in the cockpit for 10 seconds, it bypasses the false read and spools the turbine." Silence hung in the cabin, thick and heavy. Bradley stepped out of the cockpit, looking at Artie with absolute disgust. "Are you out of your mind? You're a line guy, a fueler. Don't come in here telling me how to operate a $60 million aircraft." "Just trying to help," Artie said, his face impassive. He held out the clipboard. "Need a signature for the fuel." Claire looked from Bradley to Artie. The stress was eating her alive, narrowing her vision to a sharp, cruel point. She didn't see a man trying to help. She saw an uneducated mechanic inserting himself into a crisis he couldn't comprehend. "Sign his paper, Bradley, so he can leave," Claire said dismissively. She looked at Artie, her tone dripping with the condescension of a woman who was used to giving orders to people in suits, let alone coveralls. "When you log 10,000 hours in a jet like this, I'll ask for your engineering advice. Until then, stick to pumping gas." Artie didn't flinch. He just looked at her. His eyes were slate gray, terrifyingly still. There was no anger in them, just a profound, exhausting exhaustion. Bradley snatched the clipboard, scribbled his name, and shoved it back. "Get out of here, pal, and don't give advice on things above your pay grade." "Like I said," Claire added, her voice cold, "fly this jet. Then we'll talk." Artie took the clipboard. He looked down at the signature, then back at Claire. "Have a good night, ma'am," he said quietly. He turned and walked down the stairs, disappearing into the freezing rain. 10 minutes later, the situation escalated from a crisis to a catastrophe. "Tatterborough Tower just broadcast a severe weather alert," Bradley announced, his voice trembling slightly. He was scrolling furiously on his iPad. "Wind shear warnings across all departure corridors. Gusts are hitting 50 knots. They're shutting down the runways in 15 minutes. Claire fell into one of the plush leather seats, putting her head in her hands. The ambient lighting of the cabin felt mocking. She had everything: money, power, influence. And all of it was currently useless against a chunk of frozen moisture on a sensor and a stiff breeze. "Try the override," Claire said softly. "What?" "The override. The thing the fuel guy just mentioned. Try it." "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm not taking mechanical advice from a ramp rat." "I said try it," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Bradley jumped. He scurried back into the cockpit. Claire stood up, walking to the doorway to watch him. He fumbled with the overhead panel, his manicured fingers hesitating over the switches. He flipped the APU breaker, held a switch, and waited. Nothing. "See?" Bradley said, sweating now. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." Outside, Artie was backing the fuel truck away. He watched the Gulf Stream through the sweeping wiper blades of the truck's windshield. He saw the beacon light remain dark. The APU hadn't started. He didn't hold the sequence long enough, Artie thought, shifting the truck into drive, or he did it out of order. He should just drive away. His shift was over. He had his signature. He needed to get home to Maya. She hated thunderstorms, and the sky above New Jersey was currently tearing itself apart. But as he looked at the sleek, beautiful machine grounded in the ice, something gnawed at him. He knew the aircraft, intimately, and he knew the look on that woman's face. He recognized the abyss she was staring into because he lived in it. Artie put the truck in park. He grabbed his coat, pulled up his collar, and jogged back through the sleet to the air stairs. He didn't knock. He just walked up. Claire was standing by the galley, pouring herself a glass of water with violently shaking hands. She looked up as Artie entered, rain dripping from his jaw. "I thought I told you to leave," she said, her voice wavering. Artie walked past her, ignoring the protest. He stepped directly into the cockpit. Bradley was sitting in the left seat, arguing with ground control on the radio. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Bradley yelled, ripping his headset off. Artie didn't speak. He reached over Bradley's shoulder to the overhead panel. His thick, calloused fingers moved with a blinding, mechanical fluidity. He flipped 3 switches in a rapid succession, pressed the manual override, held it for precisely 12 seconds, and then engaged the APU starter. A low, deep rumble vibrated through the floorboards. The lights in the cabin flickered, then stabilized into a bright, steady glow. The air conditioning vents hissed to life. The APU was running. Bradley sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Claire stood in the doorway, the glass of water paused halfway to her lips. "You did the sequence wrong," Artie said to Bradley, his voice flat. "You have to isolate the left bus first, otherwise the computer overrides the manual input." He turned to leave, but Claire found her voice. "Wait." Artie stopped. You fixed it." The mockery was gone from her tone, replaced by a desperate, grasping hope. "Bradley, start the main engines. Call the tower. Tell them we're taxiing." Bradley didn't touch the yoke. He stared out the windshield at the horizontal rain lashing the glass. The heavy aircraft shuddered under a massive gust of wind. "No," Bradley said. Claire froze. "Excuse me? I'm not flying in this," Bradley said, his voice rising in panic. "The crosswinds are at 50 knots. The wind shear alert is active. I'm a corporate pilot, Ms. Montgomery. I fly executives to Aspen in clear skies. I don't fly heavy iron through a squall line. It's suicide." "You are under contract." Claire stepped forward, her panic fully metastasizing into rage. "I pay you a fortune to fly this plane. Keep your money," Bradley snapped. He unbuckled his harness and stood up, squeezing past Artie. "I'm not dying for your merger." He grabbed his duffel bag from the crew closet, walked past a stunned Claire, and bounded down the air stairs into the storm. The cabin was dead silent, save for the hum of the newly revived APU. Claire stared at the empty doorway. The reality of the situation crashed over her in a suffocating wave. She had the plane. She had the power. She had no pilot. She let out a short, broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob. She slowly sank into the nearest leather seat, her pristine composure shattering. "It's over," she whispered. Artie stood in the aisle. He looked at the empty cockpit, then down at the billionaire, who looked, in this moment, entirely small and human. He reached into the chest pocket of his coveralls. He pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small plastic card. He tossed it onto the mahogany table in front of Claire. It landed with a soft clack. Claire looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. She picked up the card. It was an FAA airline transport pilot license, the highest level of pilot certification. It was issued to Arthur Hayes. Under the type rating section, a long list of aircraft was printed, including the G650. She looked from the card to the man in the dirty coveralls. "I need $50,000, Artie said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin. "Cash or wire transfer by tomorrow morning." Claire stared at him, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the fueler she had mocked 10 minutes ago and the man standing before her now. You're a pilot?" "I was," Artie said. "Now I pump gas. The runway closes in 10 minutes. I can get you in the air, and I can get you to London, but it costs $50,000. $50,000 was a rounding error in Claire's accounting. It was nothing, but she wasn't hesitating because of the money. She was hesitating because she was entrusting her life to a ghost she had just insulted. "Why 50,000? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because my daughter is deaf in one ear and losing hearing in the other, and the implants aren't covered by my insurance," Artie said. There was no plea for sympathy in his tone. It was a sterile recitation of facts. 50 grand covers the surgery and the recovery time. That's the price. Claire looked at the man. She saw the grease on his hands. She saw the absolute terrifying calm in his posture. Do it, she said. Artie didn't smile. He nodded once. Strap in tight. It's going to be rough. As he turned to the cockpit, he pulled a cheap, cracked smartphone from his pocket. He dialed a number and put it to his ear. Hey, Mrs. Higgins, Artie said, his rough voice suddenly dropping an octave, softening into something remarkably gentle. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I picked up a last-minute flight. I'm going to be gone for a day or two. Can you stay with her? A pause. Thank you. Please tell Maya that Daddy loves her. Tell her we're getting the new ears. Yeah, I promise. He hung up the phone. Claire watched from her seat, a sharp pang of guilt twisting in her chest. Fly this jet, then we'll talk. Her own words echoed in her mind, sickening and cruel. Artie slipped into the left seat of the cockpit. He didn't bother taking off his damp coveralls. He reached for the headset, slid it over his ears, and the line worker vanished. The aviator woke up. The cockpit of a Gulfstream G650 is a marvel of modern engineering, a glass cathedral of screens, readouts, and automated systems. For a pilot who hadn't sat in one in 4 years, it should have been overwhelming. For Artie, it was muscle memory. His hands moved across the panels with a speed and precision that bordered on violent. He was flipping switches, entering flight plan data into the FMS, Flight Management System, and calculating weight and balance before his seatbelt was even fully buckled. He keyed the mic. Teterboro clearance, Gulfstream 7 Whiskey Tango, IFR to London Heathrow, ready to copy. The radio crackled. The controller's voice strained. 7 Whiskey Tango, clearance on request. Be advised, ground stop goes into effect in 6 minutes. Wind is currently 290 at 40, gusting to 55. It's a mess out there, Captain. Understood, Artie replied, his voice a low, steady hum. He pushed the engine start buttons. Behind him, Claire was strapped into a forward-facing seat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the cockpit. The door remained open. The transformation in the man was staggering. The exhausted, stoop-shouldered mechanic was gone. In his place sat a man possessed of a lethal, quiet focus. The twin Rolls-Royce engines spooled up, a deep, resonant roar that shook the heavy fuselage. Artie pushed the throttles forward just enough to break the friction of the ice on the tires. The jet lurched forward. The taxi to the runway was a battle. The wind was howling off the Hudson River, slamming into the side of the aircraft. The heavy jet crabbed slightly, even on the ground, fighting to stay on the center line. Rain hammered the windshield so hard it sounded like gravel. Artie handled the tiller with his left hand, steering the nose wheel, his eyes scanning the primary flight display. 7 Whiskey Tango Tower, the radio barked. Hold short of runway 24. We have a heavy wind shear alert on the departure end. I don't recommend this, Captain. Artie stopped the jet at the hold short line. He looked out the window. The sky was an ugly, bruising black, lit only by the strobe lights of the runway. He glanced back at Claire. She was gripping the armrests, her knuckles entirely white. She was terrified, but she met his gaze. We're going to get kicked around, Artie said to her, raising his voice over the noise of the storm. I need you to stay in that seat and do not unbuckle, no matter what it feels like. Understand? Claire nodded rigidly. Just get us up. Artie turned back around. He keyed the mic. Tower, 7 Whiskey Tango is ready to roll. Request immediate takeoff clearance. A long pause. Then, a heavy sigh over the radio. 7 Whiskey Tango, cleared for takeoff runway 24. Good luck, brother. Artie didn't reply. He gripped the yoke with his left hand and wrapped his right hand around the throttle quadrant. He didn't ease the power in. He firewalled it. The engines roared, a deafening explosion of thrust. The acceleration pinned Claire back into her seat. The jet surged down the runway, but it didn't go straight. The crosswind caught the tail immediately, trying to weather vane the nose into the wind. The plane violently swerved toward the edge of the asphalt. Claire screamed, a short, involuntary sound. She braced for the impact of the grass and the inevitable crash. But Artie's right leg stomped down on the rudder pedal with brutal force. He cross-controlled the yoke, turning the ailerons into the wind while using the rudder to keep the nose pointed down the runway. It was a textbook, aggressive crosswind correction, the kind of flying they didn't teach in corporate aviation schools. It was the kind of flying learned on aircraft carriers or in combat zones. The plane stabilized, rocketing down the center line. The right wing dipped slightly to slice through the gale. 80 knots, Artie called out to the empty right seat, verifying his instruments. The rain was a solid sheet of water. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. V1, Artie said. The speed of no return. They were committed. The wind shrieked. The plane shuddered violently, the metal groaning under the aerodynamic stress. Rotate! Artie pulled back smoothly on the yoke. The heavy jet lifted off the tarmac. The second the wheels left the ground, the wind hit them with its full, unmitigated fury. The aircraft dropped suddenly, 20 feet in a microsecond, caught in a vicious downdraft. Claire gasped, her stomach leaping into her throat. The cabin overhead lights flickered. Artie didn't flinch. His eyes were glued to the attitude indicator. He didn't fight the wind, he flew through it. He applied power, pitched the nose down slightly to maintain airspeed, and then pulled back as they cleared the downdraft. He aggressively crabbed the airplane, pointing the nose almost 30 degrees away from their actual flight path just to track straight over the ground. It was a terrifying sensation for the passenger, flying sideways into the black sky. He reached down, snapped the landing gear lever up. The mechanical thud of the doors closing echoed through the cabin. Gear up, flaps up, Artie muttered to himself, managing both roles in the cockpit. They punched through the first layer of clouds, entering the soup. The turbulence was savage. The wings flexed, the aircraft bouncing violently as it climbed through 10,000 feet. Artie's hands were a blur of micro-adjustments, anticipating the plane's reactions before they even happened. Claire watched him, her breathing ragged. She realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a pilot. The man in the dirty coveralls was an apex predator in his element. The storm was throwing everything it had at the jet, and Artie was calmly, methodically dismantling it. As they crossed 18,000 feet, they broke through the top of the squall line. The violence stopped instantly. The black storm clouds lay below them like a bruised ocean. Above, a million stars burned cold and bright against the endless dark. The cabin smoothed out, settling into the gentle, vibrating hum of high-altitude flight. Artie let out a long, slow breath. He reached over, engaged the autopilot, and finally took his hands off the yoke. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his face with his grease-stained hands. He keyed the mic to speak to New York Center. New York Center, this is Navy. Artie paused, catching his slip of the tongue. He cleared his throat. This is Gulfstream 7 Whiskey Tango, climbing to flight level 450. Claire heard it. Navy. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Her legs were shaky, trembling with leftover adrenaline. She walked up to the cockpit doorway. Artie was looking out the side window at the stars. He looked exhausted, older than his 39 years. The stark contrast between the high-tech, glowing panels of the multi-million-dollar jet and his stained, frayed clothing was jarring. "You were military," Claire said softly, breaking the silence. Artie didn't turn around. He just stared at the horizon. "A long time ago," he replied, his voice barely audible over the rush of the air outside the glass. "Navy?" she pressed, her voice lacking any of the corporate edge she had wielded on the ground. F/A-18S, then test pilot school at Patuxent River, Artie said, pulling a rag from his pocket to wipe a smudge of oil off the FMS screen. "I flew things a lot faster and a lot angrier than this." Claire stood in the doorway, the gravity of her earlier arrogance crushing her. She had looked at a highly decorated military aviator, a man who had likely landed fighter jets on pitching carrier decks in the dead of night, and told him to stick to pumping gas. She had mocked him, humiliated him, and in return, he had just saved her life and her legacy. Why did you stop? She asked, the question slipping out before she could filter it. Artie finally turned to look at her. The slate-gray eyes were no longer flat. They were entirely, painfully human. My wife died, Artie said bluntly. Cancer. Maya was 3. You can't deploy for 9 months at a time when you're the only parent left. And corporate gigs, they require you to be on call 24/7, to leave your kid at the drop of a hat. He looked around the pristine cockpit, a phantom smile touching the corner of his mouth before vanishing. So I took a job on the line. Predictable hours. I get to tuck her in at night. Most nights, anyway. He paused, looking directly into Claire's eyes. A man does what he has to do. Claire swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat that had nothing to do with altitude. The sheer weight of his sacrifice, trading the sky for a fuel hose, trading prestige for his daughter's safety, hit her like a physical blow. Fly this jet, then we'll talk. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. Arthur, Claire started, her voice breaking slightly. She didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed woefully inadequate. I'm sorry, felt insulting. Don't worry about it, Ms. Montgomery, Artie said, turning back to the instruments. He adjusted a dial on the FMS. We've got a tailwind. I'll have you in London by 7 a.m. You'll make your meeting. He dismissed her, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew exactly what he was worth, regardless of who was paying him. Claire walked slowly back to her seat in the empty, luxurious cabin. She sat down, looking out the window at the stars, the silence of the cabin now heavy with something entirely new. Respect, and a profound, humbling shame. The Gulf Stream coasted at 45,000 feet. Outside the reinforced glass, the atmosphere was a bruised, heavy purple, inching toward the bruised gray of pre-dawn. The violence of the New York storm was a memory, replaced by the sterile, humming isolation of the stratosphere. Claire had not slept. She had tried. She had reclined the leather seat into a flat bed, pulled a cashmere blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. But every time she did, she saw the fueler in the freezing rain. She saw the absolute dismissive arrogance in her own face reflected in the cabin window. She threw the blanket off. The cabin temperature was a perfect 72 degrees, yet she felt a lingering, uncomfortable chill. She walked to the galley. The espresso machine, a $5,000 piece of Italian engineering built seamlessly into the walnut cabinetry, hummed quietly. She placed 2 porcelain cups under the spout. She pressed the button. The smell of dark roast briefly overpowered the scent of the leather. Claire picked up the 2 cups. She walked softly down the aisle, the carpet absorbing her footsteps, and paused at the open cockpit door. Artie sat in the left seat. The glow of the instrument panels bathed his face in a pale green-blue light. He wasn't leaning back. He was sitting upright, his eyes scanning the digital horizon, the engine readouts, the fuel flow monitors. A master checking the pulse of his machine. Coffee? Claire asked. Her voice was quiet, lacking its usual commanding edge. Artie turned. He looked at the porcelain cups, then at her. He reached out and took one. His hands were still stained with Teterboro ramp grease. It stood out starkly against the pristine white ceramic. Black, he noted, taking a sip. Thanks. You haven't moved in 4 hours, Claire said. She leaned against the bulkhead, nursing her own cup. Nothing to move for, Artie replied. He set the cup into the cup holder. Autopilot is flying the route. I'm just here to make sure it doesn't try to kill us. Claire looked at the back of his head. The collar of his cheap insulated work jacket was frayed. You could have let us sit on the tarmac, after what I said to you. I could have, Artie agreed. He didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes on the glass displays. But spite doesn't pay for pediatric surgery. The bluntness of it stung. It was a sharp reminder that this wasn't a rescue mission born of chivalry. It was a transaction. Tell me about Maya, Claire said. She surprised herself. Claire Montgomery did not ask people about their children. She considered personal lives a liability, an excuse employees used for missing deadlines. Artie went still for a fraction of a second. He tapped a finger against the edge of the yoke. "She's 7, Artie said, his voice dropping into that lower, softer register she had heard on the phone. "She likes drawing, hates math. She lost the hearing in her right ear when she was 4, an infection that aggressively attacked the nerve. Now the left one is going. The doctors say it's a sympathetic response. If we don't get the cochlear implants put in and wired up by the end of the month, the nerve pathways might degrade too much. She'll be in total silence." Claire swallowed. The coffee in her stomach suddenly felt acidic. "And your insurance?" "Denied it 3 times, Artie said flatly. "Classified it as experimental for her specific pathology. The appeals process takes 6 months. We don't have 6 months. The cash price for the surgery, the hardware, and the physical therapy is $48,600. "So you asked for 50. I figured I needed a little buffer for groceries," Artie said. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped him. "And jet fuel for my truck." Claire looked around the cockpit. The plane they were flying in cost $65 million. The operating cost for this single trip to London was roughly $80,000. She spent more on aviation catering in a fiscal quarter than this man needed to save his daughter from a lifetime of silence. The absurdity of the world, her world, pressed down on her lungs. "My father built this company," Claire said quietly, staring into her dark coffee. She didn't know why she was talking. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the exhaustion. He was a genius at logistics, a disaster at everything else. He gambled away the reserves, leveraged the assets, and then handed me the keys when the banks started calling. I've spent 5 years firing people, cutting costs, making enemies, just to keep the doors open. This London deal. It's the end of the bleeding. If I close it, the company is safe." Artie glanced at her over his shoulder. The green light caught the sharp angles of his face. "Sounds heavy." "It is." Claire looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm not a bad person, Arthur. I'm just tired. I'm so tired of fighting." "Everyone's fighting something, Ms. Montgomery," Artie said. He turned back to the window. "Difference is, when I lose a fight, my kid stops hearing my voice. When you lose, you just have to fly commercial." It was a quiet, devastating execution. Claire couldn't argue. She couldn't defend herself. He had stripped away the corporate martyrdom she wore like armor, exposing the immense, undeniable privilege beneath it. She nodded slowly, backing away from the doorway. "I'll let you fly." "Get some sleep," Artie said to the windshield. "We start our descent in 2 hours." Dawn broke over the Irish Sea not with a dramatic sunrise, but with a slow, creeping gray that dissolved the blackness. The cloud cover over the United Kingdom was thick, a solid blanket of white-gray wool stretching to the horizon. Claire was in the lavatory, splashing cold water on her face. She dried her skin with a thick monogram towel, reapplied her makeup with practiced precision, and pulled her hair into a severe, unyielding twist. She changed from her cashmere travel clothes into a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. The armor was back on, but it felt different today. It felt lighter, less constricting. She stepped out into the cabin just as the aircraft pitched downward. The seatbelt sign chimed. Through the open cockpit door, she watched Artie work. The calm of the high-altitude cruise was gone, replaced by the busy, rapid-fire environment of a major airspace arrival. Heathrow approach, Gulfstream 7 Whiskey Tango, descending flight level 200, with you. The British air traffic controller fired back a rapid string of vectors, altitude restrictions, and speed adjustments. The morning rush hour into London was a chaotic ballet of heavy metal. Artie absorbed the data instantly. He didn't use the autopilot to descend. He clicked it off, flying the heavy jet by hand. His hands moved with that same lethal fluidity she had seen on the ground, rolling the aircraft into a sweeping right bank to intercept the localizer. They punched into the clouds. The windows went entirely white. Rain smeared across the glass. The air was bumpy, jostling the cabin, but Artie's grip on the yoke was iron. 7 Whiskey Tango, cleared ILS approach. Runway 27 right, the controller crackled. Cleared the ILS 27 right, 7 Whiskey Tango, Artie responded. He reached down. Gear down. Flaps 20. The mechanical clunks and whirs vibrated through the floor. Claire sat in her forward-facing seat, watching him. There was no anxiety this time. She trusted this man with absolute certainty. The altimeter unwound. 2,000 feet, 1,000, 500. They were still in solid white clouds. Minimums, the automated voice of the aircraft called out. At exactly 200 feet above the ground, they broke through the fog. The sprawling, wet concrete of Heathrow Airport rushed up to meet them. Artie smoothly pulled the throttles to idle. He pitched the nose up a fraction of a degree. The main wheels kissed the runway with a barely perceptible bump. The nose wheel settled gently a second later. He deployed the thrust reversers, the engines roaring as they decelerated the massive aircraft. It was a flawless, textbook landing in garbage weather. 10 minutes later, the Gulfstream came to a stop at the VIP terminal. The engine spooled down, whining into silence. The APU took over, keeping the lights on. Claire unbuckled and grabbed her briefcase. She walked to the front. Artie was already shutting down the avionics. He pulled his cheap, cracked smartphone from his pocket and checked the screen. "Your car is out there," Artie said, nodding toward the window. A black Bentley was idling on the wet tarmac. Claire stopped at the door. She looked at him. The grease stains were still there, the frayed collar, the exhaustion deep in his eyes. "Arthur," she said. He turned the pilot's seat around. He reached into his chest pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, and held it out. It was a Teterboro Airport fuel slip. On the back, written in blue ballpoint pen, was a bank routing number and an account number. 50,000, Artie said. "Like we agreed." Claire took the slip. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, like sandpaper. "I can give you more," Claire said, her voice tight. "I want to give you more. For Maya. For everything." Artie looked at her. There was no anger, no pride, just a weary practicality. "I'm not a charity case, Ms. Montgomery. We made a deal. 50 gets my kid her ears. That's all I need. You pay your debts, I pay mine." He stood up, stretching his back, the joints popping audibly in the quiet cabin. "Go win your fight." Claire looked at the piece of paper in her hand. She carefully folded it and slid it into the inner pocket of her suit jacket, right next to her heart. "Have a safe flight back, Captain," Claire said. Artie offered a faint, almost invisible smile. "I'm not flying this back. I'm taking a commercial red-eye out of Gatwick in 3 hours. My shift on the ramp starts tomorrow at 6 a.m. He turned back to the shutdown checklist. Claire walked down the air stairs, stepping into the damp London morning. She didn't look back. The boardroom of Sterling Vanguard Logistics was located on the 40th floor of a glass skyscraper in the city of London. It was a room designed to intimidate. The table was a massive slab of dark mahogany. The chairs were stiff. The men sitting around the table were sharks in bespoke wool. At exactly 7:58 a.m., the heavy double doors opened. Claire Montgomery walked in. Richard Sterling, the CEO of the rival firm, paused mid-sentence. He looked at his gold Rolex, then up at Claire, his polite smile failing to mask his deep disappointment. He had bet heavily on the storm grounding her in New York. "Claire," Richard said, recovering quickly, "we weren't sure you'd make it. The weather reports over the Atlantic looked dreadful." "I have a very good pilot, Richard," Claire said. Her voice was calm, unhurried. She took her seat at the head of the table. She opened her briefcase, pulling out a single thin folder. She didn't have a team of lawyers flanking her. She didn't have a frantic, desperate energy. Normally, Claire would have walked into this room with her teeth bared. She would have launched into an aggressive, rapid-fire defense of her company's valuation, trying to bludgeon the room into submission. But as she looked around the table at these men who played with thousands of jobs on spreadsheets, men who had never felt the terrifying physical weight of a crosswind on a dark runway, she felt a profound sense of detachment. They were not the real world. The real world was a man standing in freezing rain, working overtime so his daughter wouldn't lose the sound of his voice. The real world was stomping a rudder pedal to the floor to keep a heavy jet from shearing off a runway. "Let's skip the theatricals," Claire said, folding her hands on top of the folder. "You want to absorb Montgomery Logistics because our distribution network in the Midwest is the only thing keeping your supply chain from collapsing under the new European export tariffs. You know it. I know it." Richard bristled. "Claire, our initial offer reflects a fair market." "Your initial offer is an insult," Claire interrupted, her tone not angry but devastatingly flat. "It undervalues my hard assets by 20% and my workforce by 50%. I'm not here to negotiate a surrender. I'm here to dictate terms." The room went dead silent. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the frantic, drowning CEO they had profiled. "You're in no position to dictate, Claire," a lawyer near the end of the table sneered. "Your Q3 numbers were abysmal. If you walk out of here today without our capital, Montgomery Logistics files for Chapter 11 by Friday." Claire looked at the lawyer. She felt her pulse steady. V1, the speed of no return. "You are committed. If I file for Chapter 11, I liquidate the Midwest hubs entirely," Claire said, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "I sell them piecemeal to Amazon or FedEx. They will outbid you, and your European supply chain will choke to death by Christmas. Your stock will tank, and your board will demand your head, Richard." She pushed the thin folder across the polished mahogany. "This is the merger agreement. It values Montgomery Logistics at a 40% premium over your initial offer. I retain a seat on the board, and my distribution workers get a 2-year freeze on layoffs." Richard looked at the folder like it was a live grenade. "This is absurd. You have no leverage." "My leverage is that I am willing to burn my own ships to the waterline to ensure yours sink with me," Claire said. Her voice was ice. It was a tone she had borrowed from a man in dirty coveralls staring down a hurricane. A person does what they have to do. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the boardroom was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Richard looked at Claire. He searched her eyes for a bluff, for a micro-expression of panic. He found nothing, only slate-gray, terrifying stillness. Slowly, Richard reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a fountain pen. He opened the folder. He signed the document. It was over. 5 years of bleeding, of fighting, concluded with the scratch of a nib on paper. Claire didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She packed her briefcase, stood up, and walked out of the room. She took the private elevator down to the lobby. As the doors closed, she pulled her phone from her pocket. She opened her secure banking app. She pulled the crumpled fuel slip from her jacket pocket. She entered the routing and account numbers with careful precision. Amount, $50,000. Memo, V1. She hit send. The confirmation screen flared green. Claire leaned her head against the cool glass of the elevator wall. She had won. She had saved the empire her father nearly destroyed. But as she watched the floor numbers tick down, she knew she couldn't just walk away. The transaction was complete, but the ledger in her soul felt profoundly unbalanced. She dialed a number. "Sarah," Claire said when her executive assistant answered. "I need you to do something right now. I need the full employment file on a ramp worker at Teterboro Airport. Name is Arthur Hayes, Navy veteran. I want everything you can find on him by the time my commercial flight lands in New York." "Of course, Ms. Montgomery," Sarah replied, sounding surprised. "Is there a problem?" "No," Claire said softly, watching the London traffic blur past the glass doors of the lobby. "For the first time in a long time, Sarah, there isn't." The commercial flight back to John F. Kennedy International Airport was 13 hours of forced reflection. Claire sat in first class, staring at the muted television screen embedded in the seat back. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't reviewing spreadsheets or drafting hostile emails to board members. She was waiting. When the town car finally dropped her off at her Manhattan penthouse, Sarah was standing in the foyer. The assistant held a thick manila folder. I pulled everything, like you asked, Sarah said, handing it over. She looked exhausted, having clearly worked through the night. Military records are mostly public domain, but I had the legal team pull civil court records, property deeds, and medical lien filings. It paints a difficult picture. Thank you, Sarah. Take the rest of the week off. Claire walked into her study. The room was expansive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. She didn't turn on the main lights. She sat at her heavy oak desk, clicked on a small brass reading lamp, and opened the folder. The paperwork inside was a tragedy chronicled in bureaucratic ink. Arthur David Hayes, commissioned officer, United States Navy. F/A, 18 Super Hornet pilot. 2 combat deployments, top 10% of his class at the United States Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River. His performance evaluations read like a recruitment brochure. Exceptional under pressure, unmatched situational awareness, a natural leader. Then, 4 years ago, the trajectory snapped. His wife, a woman named Diane, had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The medical records were a blur of aggressive chemotherapy, radiation, and desperate surgical interventions. There were letters from the Navy granting Artie compassionate reassignment, then a hardship discharge. He had given up a guaranteed command track to sit in hospital waiting rooms. Diane had died 10 months after the diagnosis. Claire turned the page. The next section was financial. It was a brutal ledger of a man being systematically dismantled by the healthcare system. The Navy benefits covered some, but not all, of the experimental treatments. Then came Maya's hearing loss. More bills, denials from private insurance, appeals, second appeals, final rejections. There were liens on his small house in Hackensack, maxed out credit cards. The transition from high-paying corporate flight gigs to the $22 an hour line service job at Teterboro was clearly documented. The corporate jobs demanded a rotating schedule. The line job offered a fixed early morning shift, allowing him to be home when Maya finished school. He hadn't failed. He had systematically traded every piece of his own ambition, his career, and his financial security to keep his daughter breathing and safe. Claire closed the folder. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. She looked at her own life. The antique furniture, the original Rothko painting on the wall, the silence bought with hundreds of millions of dollars. She had spent her adult life fighting to preserve a corporate logo. Artie had spent his fighting to preserve a life. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 2 years. "This is Harrison," a gravelly voice answered. Harrison was a corporate headhunter, a man who specialized in poaching top-tier executive talent. "It's Claire Montgomery," she said. "Claire, I saw the news on the London merger. Congratulations. What can I do for you?" "I'm firing my entire aviation management division tomorrow morning," Claire said flatly. "The director of flight operations, the chief pilot, the safety coordinators, all of them. They hired a coward who nearly crashed my G650, and they missed a structural fault that a line fueler diagnosed by ear." Harrison whistled low. "That's a clean sweep. You'll need a heavy hitter to rebuild a department that size. I can send you a short list of guys out of Delta and United." "No," Claire interrupted. "I already have the man for the job. But I need you to draw up a contract, an airtight, zero-loophole executive contract." She read off a list of demands. A base salary that made Harrison choke. Full executive medical benefits with a zero-deductible rider for pediatric specialty care. Guaranteed fixed hours. A signing bonus that would clear every lien on a small house in New Jersey. "Claire," Harrison said carefully, "this is highly irregular. Who is this guy? Does he have executive management experience?" "He has survival experience," Claire said. "Have the contract on my desk by 8 a.m. She hung up. She looked out at the glittering skyline of New York. The city was full of people playing games. It was time to hire someone who understood the stakes. Thursday morning at Teterboro Airport was a freezing, miserable affair. The storm from the weekend had passed, leaving behind a biting wind and a sky the color of dirty concrete. Artie was in the employee break room. The room smelled of old coffee grounds, floor wax, and damp wool. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the cracked linoleum. He was sitting at a wobbly plastic table. Across from him sat Maya. She was small for her age, wearing a puffy pink coat that was slightly too big for her. She had a sketchbook open, humming quietly to herself as she vigorously colored a picture of a dragon. Pinned to her left ear was a bulky, outdated hearing aid. The right ear was bare. "Drink your chocolate, Bug," Artie said, pushing a styrofoam cup toward her. Maya looked up. She watched his lips. "It's too hot, Daddy." "Blow on it," he signed, mimicking the action. He had been learning ASL for the last 6 months, preparing for the worst-case scenario. He checked his cheap smartphone. He pulled up his banking app. Available balance, $50,114.22. The wire transfer had hit yesterday morning. The memo line simply read V1. A heavy knot that had resided in Artie's chest for 3 years slowly began to untangle. He had paid the hospital an hour ago. The surgery was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. The doctor said the nerve pathways were still viable. She was going to hear again. He watched his daughter color. He felt a profound, exhausting relief. It was over. He had done it. "Arthur." Artie looked up. Standing in the doorway of the break room was Claire Montgomery. She wasn't wearing a designer suit today. She wore a heavy wool pea coat, dark jeans, and flat boots. Her hair was down, framing a face that looked rested, sharp, and intensely focused. The other line workers in the room, 2 guys eating stale donuts, stopped chewing and stared. Billionaires did not walk into the line shack. Artie didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. He stood up, wiping his hands on his coveralls out of habit. "Ms. Montgomery," Artie said, "you're at the wrong terminal. Signature flight support is a mile down the road." "I'm at the right place," Claire said. She walked into the room, her eyes briefly dropping to Maya. Maya stopped coloring. She looked at the strange woman, then up at her father. "Is this the pilot lady?" Maya asked. Her voice was slightly louder than necessary, the inflection a bit flat, the hallmark of someone struggling to modulate volume due to hearing loss. Artie put a hand on Maya's shoulder. "Yeah, Bug, this is her." Claire offered a small, genuine smile to the girl. "It's nice to meet you, Maya. I'm Claire." She turned her attention back to Artie. "Do you have a minute?" "I'm off the clock in 10, Artie said. "What do you need?" "The money cleared. We're square." "Not quite," Claire said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thick legal-sized envelope. She placed it on the plastic table right next to Maya's dragon drawing. "What's this?" Artie asked, not touching it. "It's a job offer," Claire said, her voice dropping into a business cadence. "Director of Flight Operations for Montgomery Logistics. You'll oversee my entire corporate fleet and the cargo division. You'll dictate maintenance schedules, hire and fire pilots, and overhaul our safety protocols." Artie stared at the envelope. He let out a short, cynical breath. "Ms. Montgomery, I appreciate the sentiment, but I told you I'm not a charity case. You bought my skills for one night. You don't owe me a sinecure." "Do I look like a woman who hands out charity?" Claire asked. Her eyes hardened, flashing with the ruthless edge that had secured the London merger. "My aviation department is a liability. They hired a contract pilot who almost got me killed, and they let a $60 million asset sit on the tarmac because they didn't know how to bypass a faulty sensor. I'm firing the entire management team at noon today." Artie crossed his arms. "There are 100 guys with MBAs and ATP certificates who can run a flight department." "I don't want an MBA," Claire fired back. "I want a test pilot. I want someone who knows the hardware. I want a man who knows what it costs to lose, because those are the only people I trust to protect my assets. And frankly, Arthur, you're the most brutally competent aviator I've ever met." Artie looked down at Maya. She was watching them intently, trying to follow the rapid exchange of words. He reached down and adjusted her coat collar. "The hours," Artie said quietly. "Corporate flight ops is a 24/7 grind. I don't do that anymore. I need to be here at 3 p.m. when she gets off the bus." "Read the contract," Claire said. She tapped the envelope. "You work Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. If there's an emergency outside those hours, you handle it from your phone. You don't fly unless you choose to. And the medical coverage includes a zero-deductible rider for pediatric audiology. They'll cover the hardware upgrades, the speech therapy, everything. Artie finally stopped. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at Claire. The cynical wall he had built around himself, the defense mechanism of a man accustomed to losing, cracked just a fraction. He picked up the envelope. He broke the seal and pulled out the heavy stock paper. He skipped the corporate boilerplate and went straight to the compensation and benefits section. He read the numbers. He read them again. This is... Artie started, his voice suddenly thick. He cleared his throat. This is aggressive. I am an aggressive woman, Claire replied evenly. I expect results. If my planes don't fly on time, or if I ever see a maintenance fault code ignored again, I'll fire you. But if you run my fleet the way you flew my jet out of Teterboro, I will pay you exactly what you are worth. She wasn't pitying him. She was challenging him. It was exactly what he needed to hear. Artie set the contract back on the table. He looked around the break room. He looked at the dirty linoleum, the sputtering fluorescent lights. He had spent 3 years in this purgatory, punishing himself for his wife's death, accepting the indignity of the line job because he believed it was the only way to protect his daughter. He had forgotten what it felt like to be respected for his mind, rather than just his willingness to freeze on a tarmac. Tomorrow, Artie said. His voice was steady now. I can't start tomorrow. She has surgery at 9 a.m. They're doing the implants. Take 2 weeks, Claire said instantly. Get her through the recovery. Let her get used to the hardware. My HR department will process your start date for the 15th, but I need your signature today. Artie looked down at Maya. What do you think, Bug? You want Daddy to wear a suit to work instead of these dirty coveralls? Maya smiled, a gap-toothed, genuine grin. Will you still smell like gas? Probably a little bit, Artie laughed, the sound rusty but real. He reached into his chest pocket, pulling out the same cheap blue ballpoint pen he used to sign fuel slips. He flipped to the last page of the contract. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name with sharp, definitive strokes. Arthur David Hayes. He handed the contract back to Claire. Welcome to Montgomery Logistics, Captain, Claire said. She extended her hand. Artie looked at her hand. His own was covered in a fresh layer of aircraft grease and grime. He wiped it vigorously on his thigh, but the dark stains remained embedded in the calluses. He extended his hand anyway. Claire didn't flinch. She gripped his hand firmly, ignoring the grease, sealing the deal with the physical weight of a mutual understanding. They were two people who had stared into the abyss from entirely different altitudes, and both had refused to blink. I'll see you on the 15th, Ms. Montgomery, Artie said. Call me Claire, she replied. She turned and walked out of the break room. As she stepped out onto the ramp, the cold wind hit her face. A Gulf Stream was taxiing in the distance, its engines whining over the concrete. It was a chaotic, noisy, brutal environment. But as Claire walked to her car, the ticking clock in her chest, the one that had been driving her toward an early grave for 5 years, was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady rhythm. Inside the break room, Artie picked up the cold styrofoam cup of hot chocolate. He handed it to Maya. Drink up, kiddo, he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. We're going home, and tomorrow we're going to get those ears fixed. Maya took the cup. She looked at the door where the strange, sharp woman had disappeared. She was nice, Maya said loudly. Artie smiled, a real, unburdened smile. He looked out the window at the freezing tarmac, knowing he would never have to drag a fuel hose across it again. Yeah, Bug, Artie said quietly. She's all right. He packed up the crayons, took his daughter's hand, and walked out of the line shack for the last time. Some debts can't be paid with a bank transfer. Claire thought she was buying a flight out of a storm, but she ended up buying a masterclass in resilience. Artie didn't just save her company. He grounded her in a reality where the stakes are measured in human lives, not profit margins. If this story of grit, respect, and quiet redemption hit home for you, Drop a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real strength doesn't need a suit and tie. Subscribe to the channel for more grounded, hard-hitting dramas every week.